Hey everyone, and welcome. So, if your book club is on the hunt for something that's, guaranteed to get a fiery debate going, well, you've come to the right place. Today, we're diving deep into Gad Saad's really provocative book, The Parasitic Mind. It's his diagnosis of what he calls the infectious ideas that are weakening Western societies. Let's get right into the central question he's asking.
Okay, so the whole book, and I mean the entire thing, really boils down to this one powerful question. Saad frames his whole argument not as just some political disagreement, but more like a public health crisis. He's asking us to think about something pretty radical. Can certain ideas act like a virus, infecting our minds, and just shutting down our ability to think straight? It's a bold premise for sure, so let's see how he builds his case. Now, to really get a grip on this book, you kind of have to understand the guy who wrote it first. Gad Saad isn't just some academic writing from, an ivory tower. He makes a really strong case that his entire worldview, his reason for fighting this intellectual battle, was forged in actual, real-world conflict. He basically says he's lived through two major wars in his life. One was a literal war, with bombs and militias. The other one, well, he says it's a war of ideas, and it's happening right now on university campuses, in the media, and in pretty much all of our daily lives. Okay, so that first war, that was the Lebanese Civil War. Growing up as a Jewish kid in Beirut, he saw the absolute horror of sectarian violence up close and personal. And that experience, he says, gave him a lifelong hatred for identity politics. And that second war, well, that's the one he says he's fighting today as a professor against what he calls these parasitic ideas that are just eating away at reason and logic in the West. So, and this is really the key takeaway here. All of these experiences boiled down to two core principles for him. The two things he claims guide everything he does: an absolute, non-negotiable defense of freedom, and an equally strong commitment to truth. He genuinely sees this modern battle of ideas as a life-or-death threat to both of those things. All right, so that brings us to the book's central metaphor. And let me tell you, it's as fascinating as it is controversial. He's not just saying, oh, these are bad ideas. No, he's framing them as literal parasites of the mind. So his main argument, the core of the book, is that the West is basically suffering from a pandemic, an infection of what he calls idea pathogens. And just to be clear, we're not talking about biological viruses here. We're talking about destructive ways of thinking that, once they get a foothold, just wreck our ability to think rationally. So what in the world is an idea pathogen? Well, according to Saad, it's a belief system that literally hijacks your brain. It makes you loyal to an ideology above everything else, above facts, above logic, even above reality itself. It works just like a mind virus, spreading from one person to the next. Okay, this next part is where he makes this whole thing really concrete with a fascinating analogy. He tells us to think about a real biological parasite called Toxoplasma gondii. It infects a mouse's brain and rewires it so the mouse is actually attracted to the smell of cat pee, which obviously is a fatal attraction. Saad's argument is that these idea pathogens do the exact same thing to us. They rewire our brains to make us embrace ideas that are ultimately self-destructive. Okay, so if we're dealing with a pandemic, what are the symptoms, right? The book spends a ton of time pointing out the specific ideologies that Saad considers to be the most dangerous idea pathogens out there today. And where do they come from? Well, he argues that universities are basically patient zero. He says this is where these ideas are cooked up, given a stamp of approval, before they escape the campus and infect the wider culture, everything from corporate boardrooms to elementary school classrooms. So the book points a finger at a few key culprits. He talks about postmodernism because it rejects the idea of objective truth. He calls out some types of radical feminism, which he claims are just completely hostile to biology. He critiques social constructivism, the idea that humans are pretty much a blank slate. And finally, what he calls the culture of endless victimhood. And all of this leads to this big umbrella term he made up for this kind of thinking: ostrich parasitic syndrome, or OPS. And this isn't just about being ignorant. He describes it as a full-blown thinking disorder that makes people actively, and even proudly, reject truths that are, completely obvious, like the sun exists. So a diagnosis is one thing, right? But any good doctor is also going to offer a cure. After spending chapters diagnosing these mind viruses, Saad finally offers up an antidote, a way he says we can inoculate ourselves against all this irrationality. But the cure he's talking about? It's not some simple pill you can take. It's a really rigorous mental framework. Instead, it's a tool, a way of thinking designed to help you build arguments that are so solid, so well supported,
that they become almost immune to ideological attacks.
He calls this tool nomological networks of cumulative evidence. Yeah, I know, it's a total mouthful. But trust me, the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. It just means you don't ever rely on just one study or one line of reasoning. Instead, what you do is you build a web, a network of interlocking evidence from a whole bunch of different fields that all point to the very same conclusion.
Let's walk through a real example from the book so you can see exactly how this works. He uses the example of a universal male preference for the female hourglass figure. You don't just look at one study. No, you pull evidence from biology, from economics, art history, pop culture, even neuroscience. He even cites studies of blind men. When every single one of these totally separate fields point to the exact same answer, well, Saad argues that your conclusion is about as close to the capital T truth as you're ever going to get.
Okay, so finally, this book isn't just some academic diagnosis or a textbook. It's really meant to be a call to arms. Saad's point is that just knowing there's a problem, or even knowing how to think correctly, well, that's not enough. You actually have to be willing to do something about it. And to show us just how high the stakes are, he brings in that incredibly powerful and famous quote from Martin Niemöller. His whole point here is that if you stay silent when you see what you believe is irrationality, that's basically a form of complicity. He warns that just being passive is a losing game in this battle of ideas.
And really, this is the book's final parting message. It's a straight-up plea for every single reader to get off the sidelines. He literally ends the book by saying, do not underestimate the power of your voice. Seismic changes start off as small rumbles. Your voice matters. Use it.
So, there you have it. That's a whirlwind tour of the Parasitic Mind. It is definitely a challenging book. It gives you a really stark diagnosis, a pretty complex cure, and a super urgent call to action. And look, it's for sure not a book everyone is going to agree with, which is exactly what might make it the perfect pick for your next book club discussion. So the real question for all of you is, are you ready for the debate this one is bound to ignite?